Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and welcome to my ultimate guide to Dan Heng, the Wind Hunt character everyone's gonna get on their account for free. He's also one of the best single target characters in the game when played to his full potential. Dan Heng can be played in two ways, and we're gonna be covering both of them. We're gonna be covering the way in which he wants to be the main damage character on the team, but also the way where he can be played as a supporting damage character. What are the difference between those? Well, the main damage character is going to want to use their skill every single turn, and Dan Heng does that quite well. But a supporting damage dealer is going to want to use an alternating rotation between their basic and their skill, so they don't consume any skill points, but actually just go neutral and build their own skill points while spending them as well. Dan Heng can play both of those roles, and he's actually very good at them. In this video, we're going to be covering Dan Heng's skills and traces, and which order you should level them up in. We're also going to be covering his full rotation and how to use him in battle, to the full of his potential. We'll also be covering relics and light cones, Eidolons, and then some of his better teams, which you can use on release. Dan Heng's basic attack, Cloud Lancer Art North Wind, is a single target wind damage nuke that generates 20 energy and deals 1 break unit of damage. However, when he unlocks one of his traces, you can increase the damage it deals by an additional 40%, and this is going to be one of the reasons he's so good as an alternating unit. Now, it only applies when an enemy is slow, however, fortunately, his skill slows, creating a very good neutral playstyle. Dan Heng's skill, Cloud Lancer Art Torrent, is a single target wind nuke which consumes 1 skill point to activate. It generates 30 energy on use and does 2 break units of wind damage to an enemy's toughness bar. Now it also has a bonus effect that it applies a slow when Dan Heng crits, and that's a 12% slow for 2 turns. Over the course of a fight, you will absolutely have this up 100% of the time, as long as you have geared Dan Heng to have some critical strike. He is a hunt character, so it's not too difficult. This will also fully enable the trace we discussed earlier for his basic attack. Dan Heng's ultimate ethereal dream costs only 100 energy. It deals 3 break units of wind damage and also regenerates 5 energy after use. It's a massive single target wind nuke that gets even bigger if the enemy is slowed. It's important to note that the wind damage multiplier 288 functions additively with the additional multiplier on the bottom there. So it's 288 plus 86, and then it's multiplied by all your other damage multipliers. So it's a very powerful effect, and the enemy will almost always be slowed in both variants of Dan Heng's rotation. Dan Heng's technique, Splitting Spearhead, will increase his attack for 40% when the battle starts for 3 turns. Overall, it's a passive technique that increases his damage, so it's one of the better ones out of all of the cast in 1.0. Absolutely have this up as soon as you have technique points available and when you need it for a strong fight. Dan Heng's talent Superiority of Reach is by far his most defining feature, and it reads as such. When Dan Heng is the target of an ally's ability, his next attack's Wind Res Pen increases by 23%. Now, what being a target means is that an ally needs to literally use an ability on him which has a targeting reticle. So whenever you use an ability, it shows all of the arrows on everyone who's going to be hit. This actually works for AoE abilities, it works for targeting abilities like Bronya's, and it works for Bailu's skill, for example. However, what will not apply is, for example, if you healed another ally with Bailu's skill, which bounces, and then it bounced to Dan Heng. He wasn't the target of the targeting reticle, he will not get the penetration. And the catch here is that it's got a 2-turn cooldown. Penetration in Star Rail is by far one of the most OP offensive stats. If an enemy has 50% resistances, and you penetrate all 50% of those elemental resistances, you would be equivalent to dealing double damage. Resistance can also go negative in Star Rail. If you have an enemy with 0% wind resistance, and you penetrated 25% of it, you would be dealing 25% more damage to that enemy. So overall, it's a great stat, and it makes Dan Heng really strong. The catch is, and the skillful part of this talent is, trying to line up buffing him at the exact right time to try and get this buff on his ultimate, as it's his biggest and best skill. The final notable bonus ability for Dan Heng is Shadow of Despair. After launching an attack, there's a 50% chance he'll increase his own speed for 2 turns. Incredibly powerful and very strong. When playing Dan Heng as a main damage character who's going to be spamming his skill every single time, level up his skill first and foremost as the #1 priority. Target his ultimate as a next priority to level up, and third of all, target his talent. When playing him as a neutral character, level up his skill first, then his ultimate, and then third his basic attack. And then finally you can level up the talent. Overall, for his bonus abilities, the most important one is going to be High Gale for the alternating playstyle, but for both Dan Heng variants, grab Shadow of Despair first. You can completely skip Hidden Dragon until you want the bonus effects behind them, which gives him more damage. However, they're not a massive impact, so that you can skip them early out if you need to save that weekly material from your Echoes of War. Overall though, it will increase his damage, so pick it up later on, but the main priorities are going to be Shadow of Despair and High Gale. Dan Heng has 2 separate rotations based on his modes of play. His main dedicated damage role has the rotation as follows. The ultimate is 100 energy, and his skill generates 30 energy. You're going to want to use his skill 3 times per ultimate. Now the thing with Dan Heng is 30 times 3 does not equal 100. You're going to be refunded 5 energy after using an ultimate, so you're at 95. You need to be hit by any attack or any sort of damage or kill an enemy in his rotation to allow him to play smoothly. Now you can do this in a number of ways, but the easiest is to place him next to a preservation unit. So here you can see if I had my Dan Heng next to my Trailblazer Fire, there was a high likelihood that he will be hit by cleave damage in the fight, which would fix his rotation and give him the 5 energy he needs. Now alternatively, you can use energy regeneration items on the rest of your characters. For example, there is an Abundance Light Cone which actually just grants all allies energy when using a skill. In addition to that, there is also another Abundance Light Cone which grants the ally which has the lowest energy total an additional set of energy. Now these are both really accessible for free to play. One of them is just straight up free to play, so you can get those light cones, and using them on your healer will also assist Dan Heng greatly with his first rotation. And then you'll be able to do 3 skills ultimate, 3 skills ultimate, rinse, repeat. Now Dan Heng's second rotation has no such energy issues. You don't need to put him next to the tank, you don't need any of that. And that rotation is as follows. You'll go skill, basic, ultimate, and repeat that and go over and over and over. Now it's important to start with a skill as it will apply the slow, which will boost your basic attack's damage. And that's going to be the neutral rotation, which consumes no skill points. You can see there that it does use an extra action, and his ultimate will be a little bit slower, so the damage will be slower and lower, but he overall won't be consuming any skill points, meaning he's a great supporting cast member. In addition to that, he brings utility in all of his breaking capabilities, which are wind, as well as that slow, which will be applying to enemies. Those are both of Dan Heng's rotations. You don't want to grab any energy regeneration on him or anything like that, so those are the endgame rotations that you guys can stick to and play with. Alright, so you've mastered both of Dan Heng's rotations and you're using them to great effect in your teams. You've got the energy stuff sorted and you're ready to maximize his potential. So Dan Heng can be one of the best damaging characters in the game if you maximize his potential. In order to maximize his potential, you need to trigger his talent, the wind penetration, on his ultimate every single time if you want to get the maximum damage. Now this is much easier said than done. Overall, what you're going to want to know is that Dan Heng's penetration tracker is right here. You can see here that we've got a nifty little orb. That means it's ready to be activated. It's not currently active, but it's ready to be activated. If I use Ting Young's ultimate here, and I use it on Dan Heng here, you'll notice that it begins to glow. And that glowing means that the next attack he's going to perform is going to be empowered with the wind penetration. And that's exactly what we're going for here. So his next skill, basic or ultimate, will be empowered. Now, after you use that skill or use that basic, it will go on cooldown. And then on the following turn, you'll need to use either 1 or 2 attacks in order to bring it back up. Now there is an exception to this rule. If you were to use it on his ultimate, it's going to go off cooldown much sooner. Now it's a little bit complicated to explain, but the TLDR is if you use the wind penetration talent on Dan Heng's ultimate, you're going to have it up much more frequently, just due to the way that the game mechanics work. If you use it on the skill, you're going to get much less damage from it because the skill hits a lot less, and it's also going to be on cooldown for longer. So you really want to try and get the ultimate active and use it with the wind penetration as much as possible, possible wherever feasible. Now this is much easier to achieve by using units such as March 7th, as well as Ting Young, and even characters like Bronya. Timing it exactly right is actually pretty tough, but you will be massively rewarded for it with a big damage increase. And that is going to be the secret behind Dan Heng and getting the most out of him. Try and structure your teams and gameplay to really get that talent on that ultimate, and you will be rewarded, as he will be one of the best single target damage dealers in the game as a 4-star. Alright guys, now that we fully understand Dan Heng's combat potential and how to use his penetration talent to the maximum efficiency, let's cover his gear and light cones next. So on screen here, you guys are going to see all of Dan Heng's calculations for each of the light cones which he's probably going to want to be using. You can see them at Eidolon 0 as well as Eidolon 2, and you can peruse these numbers at your leisure to really understand the difference between the cones. Let me get into a few specifics here though, so you guys have a little bit more context around what's going on here. So Dan Heng is a pretty quick hunt character with a lot of good access to critical strike after he gets a few Eidolons and on his gear. So anything that scales critical strike and critical strike multiplier overall is going to be a pretty good deal. Dan Heng also has very low base attack, so he wants base attack on his light cone. It's massively going to increase his damage. Let's get into the results. So In the Night gives the most base attack out of all light cones currently, with the exception of Sleep Like the Dead, which we'll talk about in a second here. It is also not free to play friendly at all. It is from the Sele banner event, and if you were pulling it, chances are you probably pulled Sele as well, and you'd want to use the code on her anyway. But it's worth noting that it is the best in slot for him, primarily because it has massive crit scaling as well as massive base attack. The next best in slot is Sleep Like the Dead, another non-free to play option which you can get from the standard banner light cones. If you end up, lucking into it, it's a great option for Dan Heng. It's the second best, but overall I wouldn't pursue it and go out of my way to grab it, as there is a very good free to play option coming up. But it also does sport massive attack as well as other base stats. Alright, moving on here, we have the next in slot here, which is Cruising the Stellar Sea, which you should easily be able to get to super in position 5 over your first few months of play. This is a great free to play light cone that everyone is probably going to want to pick up, and Dan Heng is a great candidate for making it work and be really strong. Now the thing with Cruising the Stellar Sea is it's actually going to ask you to build a little bit of a different gear set than you might be used to on your Dan Heng. So normally Dan Heng on every single other light cone configuration, you're going to want to use critical strike rating on his chest. But with Cruising in the Stellar Sea active, because it gives so much crit at super in position 5, which everyone will gain access to, you're actually going to want to use critical strike damage. So overall, Cruising in the Stellar Sea is great. There's a little asterisk there though. If you want to get the most out of it, you're going to want to use crit damage, and this is the case on most hunt characters as well. In addition to that, in the numbers on the screen you saw before, that was not including the on kill trigger here, which gives you 40% increased attack, so you can expect to get even more value out of your Cruising in the Stellar Sea for Dan Heng over the duration of a fight. It's a spectacular light cone, and if I had to pick between Sleep Like the Dead and S5 Cruising with Stellar Sea, I'd actually pick Cruising, as it gives more consistency and it also gives that on kill buff. Alright, for pure free to play non 5-star options, obviously Cruising is free to play option, and it's also very accessible and easy to get. We have River Flows in the Spring. It's the open, farmable, and easy to get option in the endgame. You get it from stuff like these shops in the overworld, you get it for farming Echoes of War, and you can also get it from the Forgotten Hall. So you can easily get 5 copies of this and take it all the way to super in position 5 over your first few months of play. Now, this light cone actually brings a pretty good amount of damage. It's definitely the next best option, but the damage is conditional. If you get hit, you will lose pretty much all the bonuses. So overall, it's probably not the best unless you're using a shield heavy team, but it is a reasonable option if you're confident that you can keep the buff up. Next on the list is Only Silence Remains. So this is probably the next best option after Cruising in the Stellar Sea if you're not confident you can keep the buff up from River. Overall, it's going to be a good option, but it does come from the gacha, but it is definitely a pretty nice one. Finally, if you're interested in a little bit of utility, you can use Return to Darkness. Dan Heng has an insanely high crit. This has good base damage. It's not the most insane damage, as you guys could see, but it does give you a chance to dispel buffs on enemies, and this can be pretty clutch on certain enemies and encounters. Overall, that should be everything you guys need to know, and you guys can plan out your Dan Heng accordingly. Personally, I'm going to be using Cruising in the Stellar Sea if another one of my characters is not already using it. Alright, Dan Heng's gear is up next. Of course, on the helmet and the gloves, just grab HP and attack, it's the only option. When it gets to the boots though, you have an option between two different stats for the main stat. You can pick up speed, it is the most damage overall, and it will give you the best results in terms of raw numbers. However, it will increase the cost of running Dan Heng in teams, making him a lot more skill point hungry. If you're running Dan Heng as a main damage carry, you're going to maybe potentially want to pick up attack instead of speed, as it's easier to get, and in addition to that, it's actually going to make him less expensive to run in the long run and consume less skill points, giving you more flexibility with your team building. But if you're confident in your team building skills and your skill point generation, speed is the better option. On a neutral Dan Heng who is alternating between using basics and skills, speed is just flat out better than attack. Moving on, let's take a look at his chest piece. Okay, again, we've got two options here. Critical strike rating is the best in slot for most light cones that you're going to be having going on, but when you get into the end game and you have good substats and you're using cruising in the Stellar Sea, as discussed earlier, critical strike multiplier will pull ahead. Now, there's a pretty good rule of thumb that you want pretty much 1% critical strike rating for every 2 critical strike multiplier on your character. If you follow that, you should be pretty set, but it's pretty easy to approach 100% crit rate on characters in Star Rail with the signature light cones and the hurdle light cones, so you do have to be pretty careful. Just make sure you're not overcapping on crit. If you notice you're getting close with all of the procs and activations, use critical strike damage. But if you notice that you're needing a little bit more and you're not too close, use critical strike rate. And if you can't get either of these, attack can be an option, but the other two are pretty much always better. On to the planar sphere sets. For his planar sphere, grab wind damage. It is by far the best. If you're having trouble finding a good wind damage set though, a wind damage planar sphere, you can use attack in the interim. Next up, the link rope. You absolutely want to have attack. It is pretty much the only good option for the primary stat there. All right, moving on to his best in slot sets. Okay, so he's got quite a lot of flexibility with his sets. To start out with, when you're just getting started, make sure to look for the primary stat first and foremost. It doesn't matter what piece it is on or anything like that. You don't need sets. You can start off with what we like to refer to as rainbow gear. Just get those main stats we just talked about right, and then move on to the sets next. But when you do get to finishing off sets and you're trying to pick up set pieces with the correct main stats, look for the following. You can use a 4-piece musket of wild wheat. That is just fine, especially in the early game, but later on you're going to be able to upgrade that set by going for a 2-piece musket and a 2-piece eagle of twilight line. That's going to give you more damage. And in the very late game, his best in slot set is to use a 4-piece eagle of twilight line. That is going to be the best, as it's going to give him a lot more opportunities to get extra ultimates in, which is a big damage increase for Dan Heng. So that's going to be where he's at with his sets. Now, moving on for the last part here on his gear, let's take a look at Dan Heng's substat priority. So as a hunt character, he prioritizes crit. He really wants to have as much critical strike rating and damage as possible. So wherever possible, you're going to want to pick up critical strike rating and critical strike damage. Again, use that rule of thumb from earlier. Now, as a third priority, you can also pick up speed as well as attack. Speed, a little bit less of a priority, as you already have a lot of speed from the boots as well as all of his traces and talents and stuff like that. So the order of operation and the order of priority is crit and crit damage. Number 1, balance them as you need, then attack, and then speed if you can end up getting it. It's never a bad thing. Okay, so that's going to be gear for Dan Heng. Alright guys, let's round out Dan Heng's guide here with his Eidolons and a little bit of team building. So I'm going to put on here the screen all of Dan Heng's Eidolon calculations. Now this is going to be with endgame gear over an 8-cycle flight in the Forgotten Hall, using only Silence Remains as his light cone, as it's a pretty accessible, pretty low power one, and we can truly see the impact of all the Eidolons and how they scale. Alright, so first up, let's talk about Eidolon 1 here. We've got the higher you fly, the harder you fall. And getting this Eidolon is roughly a 3.29 damage percent increase over Eidolon 0. Now the thing here is that it's going to give you a ton of extra crit, but only conditionally. So you got to be really careful that you don't end up overcapping your Dan Heng's crit. So make sure you pay attention to that, as we mentioned earlier. Eidolon 2 is going to be a big damage increase, 6.58% over Eidolon 1 here. It's going to reduce the talent cooldown by 1 turn. Now this actually makes Dan Heng even harder to play. If you want to line up the ultimate and then also weave in a penetration skill in between, things start getting a little bit challenging, and overall you're absolutely going to need to be playing with a hyper carry kind of support if you want to consistently do this, or managing your resources very effectively to make sure that he's receiving heals or shields or something along these lines to really take advantage of this talent. You still want to be triggering on the ultimate, but you're also going to want to be triggering on a skill in between ultimates. So that can definitely be a bit difficult to manage, but overall it's going to be a pretty big damage increase if you can master that rotation. Overall 6.58%, not too bad. Eidolon Eidolon 3 is going to be giving him a pretty big increase in damage, increasing his skill damage, and of course, that's going to result in a pretty big gain. 5.4% more damage. Unconditional, no changes required. Eidolon 4 is going to give him a bit of sweeping potential and a bit of hyper carry potential. He's going to be able to use his ultimate to now advance his action forward and go for another attack if he gets a kill. Pretty damn nice, but definitely not got anything on Sally and her abilities, but it's definitely not too bad, and it does give you a pretty cool combo there. Eidolon 5 is going to increase his ultimate damage, which results in a big damage gain, 5.39% over Eidolon 4, and Eidolon 6 here is going to improve his slow state and give him a little bit more utility, which is always welcome, but it's not giving any damage necessarily. Overall, none of Dan Heng's Eidolons are necessary or mandatory to make him work. They're just a little bit of extra juice that are going to make him a little bit stronger. So don't worry if your Dan Heng is at Eidolon 0, there's no issues and you can chill out and keep him there for as long as you need. He's going to be just great and smash most of the content available to you in release. Alright, to finish things off, let's do and talk a little bit about Dan Heng's team potential here. So what you're seeing in the background here is a Sushang team who aims to focus on giving Sushang the most ability to use her skill, ultimate, and all that goes with it. Now in order to do so, Sushang needs a ton of skill points. She's not cheap to run. So we've got our two supports here, Trailblazer Fire as well as Natasha, who are going to be generating skill points. Now overall, because Sushang is so expensive, there's not going to be any skill points left over from Trailblazer Fire and Natasha for Dan Heng here. She's going to gobble them up all on her own. So what's Dan Heng to do? Well, he's going to be using his neutral playstyle or supporting DPS archetype that we talked about earlier. He's going to be using a rotation of skill, basic, ultimate, and he's not going to require any skill points at all from either of the supports. He's going to be self-sufficient. And here, this really works in his favor. He's going to be bringing break to the table for wind. He's also going to be bringing a modest amount of damage. And overall, he's a pretty good fit for this team composition. The next composition we have here is going to be focusing on Dan Heng and providing him all of the damage and skill points he needs to do a big damage deal. Alright, so we've got our normal two supports here, which we discussed before, but now instead of Sushang, Dan Heng's going to be the star of the show. He's going to be the main damage carry. And we've got Tin Young here to assist him with that endeavor. She's obviously going to bring a ton of buffs to him, which will increase his damage, but she also has an ultimate which is targeted as well as a skill which is targeted, which is going to give us ample control over Dan Heng's talent and allow us to try and get that wind penetration on the ultimate just like we want it. So Tin Young's actually a pretty good and decent support as well. The only downside of bringing Tin Young is she's very in demand for all the teams you want to play. So if you're in the Forgotten Hall, it's a pretty big opportunity cost to use her on a non-hyper carry target. Dan Heng's not a hyper carry, he doesn't have much sweeping potential, so overall, while she's a good accompaniment to him, she might be better used somewhere else. Alright, next up, team number 5, we have the great and solid free-to-play core here. We've got our normal two supports generating skill points, and we've got Dan Heng here as a main damage character. He's here, he's in action, and he's dealing his normal rotation of 3 skills and an ultimate. And in this situation, we actually have Serval playing the role that Dan Heng was in the first team. She's going to be playing as a neutral or supporting damage dealer. She's going to be going skill, basic, similar to how Dan Heng was. So he can still be the star of the show without needing a dedicated support for him. He can be running in double damage offensive teams. A final note here on team building with Dan Heng is to try and run one of the 2 abundance light cones I'm about to mention to try and fix his energy issues as we discussed earlier. First and foremost, there is Quid Quo Pro, which is a completely free-to-play friendly option which you can get in-game by farming. Putting this on your healer has a chance to grant him 16 energy once you get it to max rank, which you can do by farming and completing the Forgotten Hall. This completely fixes most of Dan Heng's energy issues if it lands on him once per rotation, which isn't hard to do, and it can definitely improve his stats and his overall performance and ease of use quite significantly. Alternatively, you can also use Shared Feeling. Shared Feeling will give you 4 energy every single time your healer uses their skill. Now, of course, you actually do need to get this from the gacha, so it's not as easy to get, and at Superimposition 1, it only gives 2 energy, so overall, I'd recommend going with the free-to-play option, Quid Quo Pro, but this can also assist with fixing Dan Heng's rotation, on top of maybe getting some kills, and then, of course, putting him next to the tank. Dan Heng is an absolute free-to-play staple, and if you can nail his penetration rotation, he is an absolute monster in terms of damage. He's also a great windbreaker, and I don't see him going anywhere anytime soon on anyone's free-to-play account, so you can be sure that leveling him up and investing in his gear is going to be a pretty good option, at least from what we know so far. Hopefully you guys have learned something new about Dan Heng, and you've enjoyed the guide, and if you did, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll be doing a guide on as many playable characters as I can as soon as they are released. and I'm going to try and cover everyone in the long run. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time, cheers.